Spontini's Fernand Cortez premiered at the Paris Opera on the 28th of November 1809. Commissioned the previous year by Napoleon to support his campaign in the Iberian Peninsula, it was intended to encourage identification with Cortez and his soldiers in their conquest of Mexico for the Spanish crown in 1520. In the first act, Cortez fears for his brother who's been captured. He's offered peace if he will leave Mexico, but he sets fire to his fleet to demonstrate his commitment. In Act 2, Cortez hopes to exchange a Mexican prisoner for his brother, but the Aztec priests demand instead his Mexican lover, Amazili, who makes the decision for him and sets off swimming to the city to sacrifice herself. In the final act, Cortez, on horseback at the head of his troops, arrives in time to save both Amazili and his brother from sacrifice in the Aztec temple and liberate the Mexican people, who join the Spanish in a triumphant final chorus celebrating the uniting of two nations. As a piece of propaganda, it was intended to highlight the enlightened leader's heroic actions, drawing parallels between the humanitarian Cortez, liberating a people from fanatical priests, and Napoleon and his troops, supposedly emancipating the Spanish people from the Inquisition. But in spite of good ticket sales and praise in the press, the opera was ordered by the Minister of Police to be withdrawn after just 13 performances. It seems to have been received in some quarters as a celebration of the occupied nation's bravery and condemnation of the invading army's brutality. In this paper, I seek to understand the complexity of the opera's reception by considering political events during 1808 and 1809, by examining Napoleon's approach to propaganda in these years, and by examining the dynamic between audience and spectacle. Although the opera harnessed the spectacular aesthetic of the revolutionary decade, the underpinning ideology of shared experience had given way to a more straightforward narrative of imperial might. However, it was difficult to control the way in which audiences would react emotionally and intellectually to the spectacle. Looking back from 1817, Etienne de Jouy presented the central problem he'd faced as librettist to encourage sympathetic identification with the invading power for it to function as propaganda. I thought it my primary duty to present the spectator with a natural exposition and compel him to pity the fate of the Spanish prisoners in order to soften the odious aspects of their victory later on. However, between the sympathy inspired by the temerity and audacity of the conquerors and that felt for the miserable fate of the conquered, the soul remains uncertain and, as it were, suspended. Reviewers did pick out the unaccompanied prayer sung by 3 Spanish prisoners in the final act as a favourite item. But by November 1809, the odious aspects of Cortez's victory were hard to ignore when Napoleon's similarly brutal behaviour in Spain was drawing widespread condemnation. The Peninsular War, or the Spanish War of Independence, was a particularly bloody and complex conflict, with profound implications for control of Latin America and the future partition of the Ottoman Empire. I'm just going to rattle through some of the facts. I'm not going to be talking about everything on this slide. Essentially, exploiting differences between Spain's King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand, Napoleon seized the throne in May 1808 and conferred it on his elder brother, Joseph Bonaparte. This action, unsurprisingly, provoked a popular uprising against the French that lasted for 6 years, conducted by guerrilla fighters and various juntas on the one hand, and the regular Spanish army on the other, which was aligned with British forces under Wellington and the Portuguese army. The situation was further complicated by those who had been in Charles's government who were loyal to Joseph and the French, who they hoped would help to modernise their backward state. Napoleon's intervention was almost universally condemned by contemporaries in France and across Europe and by subsequent historians, and it has been seen as the turning point in his fortunes as emperor. He believed Spain was a backward nation in ruins because of its weak regime. He was rescuing it from the abyss, as he had done for France with the overthrow of the Directory and for Naples with the removal of the Bourbons. But public opinion, documented in numerous letters and diaries, was hostile, and many believed he was instigating a war against France's former ally for personal glory rather than for the benefit of the nation. The excesses and atrocities of the war were various and unprecedented. Napoleon carried out brutal reprisals following humiliating French defeats in the summer of 1808, and a Spanish witness declared, "We may date from this period the manifest moral change which took place in the French army. Military discipline has vanished." The historian David Bell has claimed that some of the worst urban combat ever seen in Europe before the 20th century took place at the siege of Saragossa. The city finally surrendered in February 1809. A Spanish officer serving under the French wrote, "The French could only maintain themselves in Spain through terror. They were constantly facing the need to punish the innocent along with the guilty, of revenging themselves on the weak instead of the powerful." Meanwhile, Napoleon had returned to Paris in January 1809, believing that Spanish resistance had been broken. 4 months later, he was occupying Vienna. The Treaty of Schönbrunn was signed, ending the Fifth Coalition following the French victory at Wagram. Napoleon was reinstalled at the Tuileries in November, just 2 weeks before the premiere of Fernand Cortez. It's been widely acknowledged that Napoleon, inheriting the lessons of the revolution, was one of the first to understand the importance of public opinion and the need, in his words, to put the whole nation into a kind of intoxication. He therefore communicated frequently with his subjects, in part through daily bulletins published in the press, and he established a system of official propaganda through education, religion, and the arts, including theatre. Capitalizing on the accidents of war, he exaggerated his successes and kept his name associated with victorious and heroic action. In the theatre, Napoleon's approach was partly inspired by that of the previous regime. In the 1790s, tableaux of erupting volcanoes, floods, burning buildings in the theatres captured something of the overwhelming, sublime experience of revolution. An immersive aesthetic encouraged the collapsing of lived experience into the represented world on stage and engagement in the evolving national drama. Napoleonic theatre built on this idea, but, as I'll argue, the presumed subject position of the spectator was rather different. A key weapon in Napoleon's arsenal was the public festival. Starting in 1805, the various revolutionary fêtes and celebrations were gradually reorganized into a new system of imperial festivals. They became the primary vehicles for disseminating messages about the legitimacy and goodwill of the government, bringing men and women from all classes into the public arena to observe staged manifestations of the virtues of their government and to express their support for the regime. While revolutionary festivals had focused on the collective sovereignty of the people, with participatory reenactments and events, Napoleonic festivals centered on the sovereign himself. Celebrations marking Napoleon's coronation in 1804 were an important step in this newly configured festival culture. For art historian Kevin Salatino, the fireworks for the coronation represented the consummation of what he terms the political sublime. The spectacle echoed the firework displays of 1782, which had commemorated the birth of the Dauphin under the old regime, and of 1794, which had celebrated the revolutionary Fête de la Fédération. But on this occasion, the rocky foundation of the 1782 scene is a replication of the symbolic Mont Saint-Bernard, the path through which Napoleon had crossed the Alps in 1800 to defeat the Austrians at Marengo. The whole edifice, Salatino suggests, is a monumental realization of David's official 1801 portrait of Napoleon crossing the pass, as a famous painting in the bottom left there. It incorporated conventions of the natural sublime, mountains, a volcanic eruption of fireworks, and the cumulative force of the traditional language of festival, drawn from royal, revolutionary, and religious ceremonies. The natural sublime here legitimizes the sublimities of conquest and predestined empire. Typically, festivals would begin with a Te Deum, extensive military rituals and training exercises would follow, then food and drink, and events would conclude with games, dancing, and fireworks. Perhaps the most transparent fusion of past traditions with the new political ideology was the establishment in 1806, as we heard in Annelise's paper, of the Festival of Saint Napoleon, a newly resuscitated Roman martyr. There he is again. As Annelise told us, the 15th of August happily marked Napoleon's birthday and the Assumption, and was declared a national holiday. An imperial catechism was introduced to link God with Napoleon and consolidated his authority. It features fantastic lines, including, "We owe to Napoleon love, respect, obedience, fidelity, military service, and the taxes levied for the preservation and defence of the empire and his throne." There are all sorts of just very sort of explicit fusion of these two aspects. In such images as this one, Saint Napoleon effectively replaces the Virgin. In these representations, the personal, religious, and militaristic merge. The grandiosity is exaggerated, and the viewer's response is conditioned by that of the internal spectators. And here we've got representations of his marriage festivities from 1810. So he divorced Josephine shortly after the premiere of Fernand Cortez and married Marie-Louise of Austria. Can see in the image, hands are raised in astonishment. There are gestures of awe and wonder in the face of imperial massiveness. Our sympathy with the spectators functions, for Kevin Salatino, as a bridge to the experience of the sublime that is represented. In many ways, the magnificent spectacle produced at the opera in November 1809 for Fernand Cortez replicated the format of such official festival celebrations. An unprecedented 180,000 francs was spent on the opera. A large part of the budget was blown on 17 horses, provided by the equestrian showman Franconi. Opposing choruses of Spanish soldiers and Mexicans provided the backbone for the work. Ambitious offstage choral and instrumental effects were deployed, enlarging the theatrical space, and Mexican and military instruments were added to the orchestra. Unprecedented attention was paid to visual realism, and again, Annelise, where's Annelise? Annelise is, sorry, I keep looking at the wrong place. Annelise has done lots of really interesting, fascinating work on the visual details for this opera, and looking at the role of history in the way in which the opera was created and received. Some of the critics dutifully picked out the parallels between Cortez and Napoleon. Oops, there we go. Some of the magnificence there in a contemporary sketch. It is proper to observe that at the very time when the Spanish conquerors were so rightly taking a stand against these abominable sacrifices in Mexico, the Inquisition was authorizing a similar one in their own country. All honor to the hero of mankind, Napoleon, who's just destroyed in Spain this horrible profanation of a religion of gentleness, of peace, and of charity. So there are plenty of critics who are towing the line and pointing to the parallels between the opera and current events. The action-packed ballet that concludes the first act features a series of military exercises and warlike dances. Their implicit referencing of successful campaigns and mix of military bravado and entertainment echoes the format of the Napoleonic festival outlined earlier and the glorification of the regime. But were audiences really likely to sympathize with the onstage Spanish soldiers and see the parallels with the situation in contemporary Spain in the way that Napoleon intended? Were their hearts really transported by a drunkenness of the senses into identification with the invader, as 19th century opera historian Théodore de la Jarte has suggested? Did they cross Salatino's bridge to the experience of the sublime in sympathy with the project of empire? In other words, was it possible to intoxicate the nation and shape public opinion so precisely? Few critics, if any, seem to be drawn uncritically into the narrative. However, they did discuss the all-too-real sensory bombardment which seems to have encouraged a more instinctive identification with the horrors of war. This derived in part from the orchestra and its large complement of brass and percussion, which David Charlton has memorably described as a Napoleonic juggernaut, rolling with unique and repellent power, bludgeoning the listener. And in part, it derived from the choruses. The drama emerges less from the dilemmas of the individual protagonists and more from the endless collective declarations of the Mexicans and Spanish, who externalize and magnify the conflict and its resolution. Moreover, march music infiltrates the whole score, even finding its way into the solo numbers and ensembles, lending it a relentless energy. In addition, most disorientatingly perhaps, offstage choruses with accompanying bands frequently up the ante and provide further urgency. In other words, excitement is generated by overflowing scenic and oral grandeur, by violence, noise, and clashing forces, by constant movement. Critics reported exhaustion, being overwhelmed. This assault on the senses is illustrated by the series of coups de théâtre that comprise the Act 1 finale. The momentum builds and the tempo increases with each section. At the end of the ballet, during which Mexican women try to seduce the Spanish soldiers into pacifism, Cortez's elite soldiers arrive. The cavalry charges, this is where the 17 horses come in, and critics are very impressed at Franconi's ability to not only choreograph the horses, but the crowds around. It's a very crowded stage. And the Mexicans register their horror in the chorus, "Ô terreur, ô prodige." The terrifying spectacle of the Spaniards on horseback was apparently key to Cortez's campaign in the ways in which it was being discussed in histories at the time. Cortez refuses to leave, and the Spanish fleet goes up in flames on his orders. Several ships explode, others sink, smoke hangs in the air. Spanish and Mexicans together register shock in a short, fast chorus, accompanied by the full firepower of the orchestra, including 3 trombones. The Spanish launch into a majestic, triumphant march and declare their faith in Cortez. Judging from the reviews, such sequences seem to have triggered an instinctive fear in at least some of the spectators, akin to that experienced by the onstage peoples, variously Mexican and Spanish, rather than preserving the safe distance required for a more considered alignment with the sublime imperial ambitions of Cortez and Napoleon. The critic of the Gazette de France claimed the display and noise were too true and too raw for the theatre. They offended the spectator. In fact, there's a striking disconnect between the triumphalist tone of the opera and other propaganda in 1809. The Spanish campaign intensified a crisis in public opinion. Not only were Napoleon's actions attracting criticism even from his erstwhile sympathizers, but the French army was also in trouble across a number of fronts. Military atrocities could no longer be justified by success on the international stage. Instead, a concerted effort was made to transform Napoleon's image. A painting competition, had been held to depict the day after the bloody battle at Eylau in East Prussia, when Napoleon had visited the wounded. The winning submission by Antoine Jean Gros presents Napoleon as a Christ-like saviour. It was displayed at the 1808 Salon with a number of other paintings promoting the theme of clemency and pardon to quell rumours about the extent of carnage on the battlefields. This move was intensified in 1809, notably following the Battle of Wagram in July, one of the largest land battles ever fought at the time. Although it led eventually to a French victory, no celebrations were held when Napoleon returned to Paris. The triumphalist nature of Fernand Cortez contrasts strikingly with such low-key depictions of a sympathetic emperor and the abandonment of celebrations after Wagram. One obvious conclusion to draw is the unsuitability of opera as a tool for propaganda. Cortez was more than a year in the making, and political events changed rapidly and unpredictably during its gestation, stranding its premiere in very different circumstances. But its relation to other Napoleonic spectacles, official festivals, firework displays, anniversary prints, invites us to press on the relation between audience and spectacle. Such works tended to echo and borrow from other representations, past and present, referencing key events, rather than evoking actual experiences and emotions. Salatino's conception of the political sublime, whereby firework displays and representations on the page gesture towards the transcendent, requires critical distance. And there are some isolated moments in Fernand Cortez when intimate expression of individuals, contrasted with the oral and visual onslaught, seem to have triggered sublime transport, in the words of some of the critics. A notable moment, perhaps the only moment actually that critics really talk about, is the trio of Spanish prisoners in the third act that I mentioned earlier, whose hymn, expressing fear and foreboding as they await sacrifice, is set in relief by the offstage noise of approaching barbarous Mexicans. The transcendent project of empire is intuited by a number of critics at this moment. But these moments are rare and soon subsumed by the massiveness of the forces, the surround sound of the choruses and military bands, the relentless marches, the shocking coup de théâtre. So, although Napoleonic theatre inherited the immersive aesthetic of the revolutionary decade, it stood in a different relation to the spectator. While the sovereignty of the people might only have been an illusion during the 1790s, spectacles were nevertheless created around this fiction. Audiences were invited to project themselves into the drama as participants in a carefully calibrated narrative, intended to reinforce the sense of a shared experience and agency in the real world. They oscillated between sensory absorption and critical reflection and, with luck, intuited a glorious future created through the revolution they had participated in. Napoleonic spectacle dispensed with this illusion of co-creation. The public was rather confronted with the power and authority of the current regime. In Fernand Cortez, the sensory onslaught seems to have triggered real fear, enhancing this effect. At a basic level, then, this worked as propaganda. But if one tries to move beyond this naked display of power and relate it to the narrative, and map that onto specific political circumstances, as Napoleon seems to have intended, its impact becomes less certain. The musical and scenic effects on display in Fernand Cortez, and the relationship between spectacle and reality, sovereign and people, were reconfigured during the Restoration. And the opera enjoyed popularity in substantially revised form from 1817, but it was received as a cautionary tale about tyranny and very firmly in the past. These relationships between spectacle and reality, sovereign and people, of course became central to the emerging genre of grand opera, which in turn inherited the aesthetic of immersive spectacle that had served revolutionary and Napoleonic regimes, and were to serve the competing voices of a new era. Thank you very much.